Hello and welcome wherever you are in the world to Oxford. My name's Adam Smith. I'm the Edward Osborne Professor of US Political History and the Director of the Rothermere American Institute, which is Oxford's Centre for the Study of the United States and its place in the world. This is the third of our America Decides election events. And if you want to know more about our program, we have more public events to do with the election and many more public events about other things across the year. Please visit our website or follow us on Twitter at RAI Oxford. I'm delighted this evening, just 3 days before the culmination of what may well be the most consequential presidential election of any of our lifetimes, to welcome an extremely high-powered panel to discuss where we're at now, what we should expect next week, and what it tells us more broadly about the state of American politics. Bob Shrum is a former political strategist and consultant who is described as the most sought-after consultant in the Democratic Party by Atlantic Monthly. Bob was the speechwriter to George McGovern in 1972 and press secretary to Senator Ted Kennedy from 1980 to 1984, a senior advisor to the Gore campaign in 2000 and the Kerry campaign in 2004. He's now the co-director of the University of Southern California Dorn's Life Center for the Political Future. Thank you very much for joining us, Bob.
Happy to be here.
Mike Murphy is one of the Republican Party's most successful political consultants. He worked on the presidential campaigns of George H.W. Bush and John McCain in 2008, and has also consulted for Jeb Bush, Mitt Romney, Arnold Schwarzenegger, and Christine Todd Whitman. He is a frequent political commentator in the media and is the co-host with David Axelrod of the podcast Hacks on Tap. And if you are an election nerd and you don't know that podcast, you should definitely listen to that podcast. With Bob Shrum, Mike Murphy is the co-director of the USC Dorn's Life Center for the Political Future. Mike, thank you so much for sparing the time to join us today.
Thank you.
And Clare Malone is senior political writer for FiveThirtyEight. I think if you're tuning in and listening to this, you probably know what FiveThirtyEight is. You may even spend a lot of time on it in the early hours of the morning, as I do. In addition to writing for the website, Clare is also a co-host of their FiveThirtyEight weekly podcast, which, as with Hacks on Tap, if you don't know it, you should definitely put it in your podcast feed and listen every week. Clare was formerly on the editorial staff of The New Yorker, and her writing has appeared in many publications, including The New York Times, The New Yorker, The American Prospect, and many others. Clare, thank you so much. This is such a busy time, and I'm really grateful to the three of you for sparing an hour to join us now.
Good to be here.
Word to the audience, we really want your questions. Please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Write your questions in. I will read out as many questions as I can in the hour, but I apologize in advance if I don't manage to get to your question. Just to kick things off then, I'd like to ask the panel, please, just to give us your headline assessment of the state of the race right now. Bob.
Look, in our poll, in our USC Dorn's Life Daybreak poll, I think we're right around an 11-point advantage nationally for Biden. Claire, I think FiveThirtyEight is 8.7 or 8.9, something like that. Over 80 million ballots have already been cast. So those numbers, if they're accurate, actually require Trump to gain even more ground than if we were having a normal election where most of the votes were cast on election day. Every day that nothing changes, that there's no big event, is a wasted day for Trump. And his strategy at this point seems to come down to holding mass rallies all over the country, which a lot of the polling shows people disapprove of, because of a lack of social distancing. People aren't wearing masks. And in fact, in Wisconsin tonight, I think it is, he's going to be required to have a rally that has no more than 250 people. I want to watch that because I think it's going to be very entertaining to see how he does in that context. I think that the Trump campaign right now has only one route to victory, and that is to raise non-white college voters' participation in the election to astronomical levels, because otherwise they're in a demographic cul-de-sac. I mean, they have no real appeal to African Americans. I think Latinx voters are increasingly moving back toward the levels that they were in 2016. They may be slightly below it. They may be slightly above it. So they've got to really push that demographic to levels that we have never seen in an election. I doubt that that will happen. And I also think that there's evidence that while Trump is winning the groups he won in 2016, he's winning them by less than he did in 2016. So among, for example, we had a survey among rural white women, non-college women, where he won 3-1 in 2016. He was winning 2-1.
Mike Murphy, you're the strategic advisor to Republican voters against Trump. How are you seeing the election right now?
Gleefully, because I'm one of those never Trump Republicans. I was running politics for the governor of New Jersey back in the 90s when Donald Trump showed up in Atlantic City, and I got to experience the Donald back then. So I'm an original never Trumper. I wonder where all the Johnny-come-latelys came from, but I'm glad they're here. We are in an election that won in a pandemic, which is a first, combined with the trend toward more vote by mail, which of course has been accelerated and increased by the pandemic and also intensity on both sides. Some people really want to get that vote in early. Election day is 2 weeks long. You can even argue longer. And we're 2/3 through election day. So the race is really over. We're just voting now, the final waves of voting. So unless modern polling, which is often uneven and backward looking, but unless it's all wrong, Joe Biden's going to win this election. Now, at Republican voters against Trump, way back in May, we thought, all right, of all the stuff we're up to, which is heavily a permission campaign to try to take Trump's Republican number from 93% down to 88 or 85, because even though that seems like a small thing, it's quite material in a close state. And our argument was to show Republicans it's okay to leave the tribe. As I like to joke, you can rent, not buy Joe Biden for a day for the good of the country, because Trump is unfit. He's also not a conservative, in my view. He's a populist. So back in May, when we set up all the permission campaign, we also said, what's the one most horrible thing we could do to Donald Trump? And that was beat him in Florida. So we've spent about $12 million on a highly targeted campaign in Florida, because in our electoral college system, Florida is really important. No Republican has won the presidency without Florida in 96 years. So we have been pounding basically white independent voters and soft suburban Republicans. We've also been very active in the Miami media market among particularly older Cubans who tend to vote Republican and have real suspicions about Joe Biden, Kamala Harris. We've been trying to chip away at that, where Trump has had some success. So we're pretty happy. The media has a bias to make every election a close election. That's why if you turn on one of our cable networks, and I work for NBC, we're all kind of guilty of it. Every day is the Hindenburg. Every bit of trivia that day is the most important thing in the campaign. Everything is breaking news. Every poll is a neck-and-neck race. Not really. Right now, Biden is up 4 to 6 points, I firmly believe, in Florida, based on our tracking and other private polls I pay a lot of attention to. Florida is a generically close election. That may, on election day, be 3 points. But should Joe Biden win Florida, which will report quickly, they count the absentee ballots preemptively there, unlike many other states, including Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania, we're going to have to wait for this big mystery vote. And Florida is going to be clear by 10 or 11 at night. And if Biden beats them there, that is the sound of Donald Trump's political neck snapping. So, never say never. The greatest accomplishment of Trump has been to put a Rasputin mind twist on the media, that he has a magic ram's horn he can blow, and this huge horde of voters come out of the woods and he wins based on the PTSD of 2016. But every bit of empirical evidence I see now, from turnout to the detailed research we're doing, shows Biden in a very strong position. And again, it's not like a big scandal today would change the outcome when we've already got probably 80 million votes in the pipeline to be cast. So I'll wait and see, keep working, but I think Biden is in a commanding position.
538 currently has Trump at, I think, an 11% chance of winning, although Nate Silvers on Twitter is constantly emphasizing that that means that he does have a real chance. But how are you seeing this? You've covered this election. You've obviously covered different elections. You've spent months talking to voters and writing about it. How has this election been for you, and how are you feeling about it right now?
Yeah, so I think the headline version is the race is stable, but to offer the press side of this is that we're all very unsure about Election Day and the cascading effects of post-Election Day. So to back up a second, yes, we are currently giving Biden we're trying to phrase it this way this year. He has an 89 in 100 chance of winning the White House, because we realized after 2016, and I think this is a very understandable problem that people had, is a lot of people didn't understand that when we said 73% chance that Clinton wins the White House, well, that there were other universes in which that was possible. So I think we are trying, and I think we have gotten much better at communicating probabilities, which, and unfortunately, I think the pandemic has also made people, Americans in general, more broadly familiar with numbers and probabilities and these data modeling, which, readers of 538 will always know about. But to go to the race is stable, but I think there's a lot of, I believe it was Mike who brought up the fact that we've had so much mail-in voting, that there are currently court cases making their way through, and sort of smoke signals being read by Supreme Court watchers for some of these decisions coming out. In fact, I'm keeping my eye on Pennsylvania. We have Pennsylvania as our tipping point state, and frankly, Pennsylvania has some interesting, and by interesting I mean potentially volatile vote counting that could potentially make its way to the Supreme Court. So I think that while the race is stable, a lot of people in the press are currently thinking about how to, cover election night if there's a clear result and Biden is the winner, but Trump refuses to accept the results of the election. How do you fact check the president and in real time, and how do you stop the spread of misinformation? So in many ways, it's a stable race, but it's also unstable from, I guess I would call it, a psychological point of view.
There's obviously, there is this phenomenon of the possibility of a red mirage followed by a blue shift, which I think is the jargon, which means the impression of a Republican victory on Election Day on Tuesday, on the grounds that more Republicans will actually show up to the polls and vote in person in key states. But then when the votes are tallied later and the postal votes are tallied, it turns out that in fact there's been a Democratic victory. And I guess it's in this context that it's not difficult to conceive a situation in which the president has a victory party in his hotel on election night and kind of dares everybody else to kind of take his victory away from him. Claire, I want to ask you about the process of calling the states. I mean, I'm talking particularly from a kind of UK audience. I mean, in a British general election, we know the result in each constituency when the returning officer goes onto the stage and reads out the results. What happens traditionally in American elections is that it's the networks that call a state. I know that 538, you were telling me earlier, has involved with ABC in that process. Can you talk about how that works?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not familiar with the full specifics of how a call is decided, but we are owned by ABC News, and so we are kind of beholden to their decision making on election night. So what they'll do is, they're keeping tabs the whole night on vote counts, and they will have thresholds where, beyond this point, there's no probability or statistical way that, so-and-so can win the election. I think that the networks will probably be pretty conservative about calling this year. The 2000 election was sort of a disaster for all of the networks. They were all really taken to tasks, often by themselves, their own anchors, for making calls too early in order to, have the scoop. So I think we're certainly going to be a lot more conservative about that. And I think a lot of people in the media have been good about trying to communicate to voters that we're going to take a longer time to count the results of the election. In fact, if people go to 538 right now, our top story is an interactive that basically shows you this is when we expect to have votes counted by. And there aren't that many states where there's an expectation that nearly all the votes will be counted on election day. And by the way, this is counter to something that Brett Kavanaugh said in one of his concurring opinions, where he said, a lot of these states expect to have results by election night or the next day. That is not the case. And so we need to make that pretty clear as a media to the American people and to the world that this could be a slow count.
Some states are expected to be slower than others, though, aren't they? Because there are some states that are allowing the counting of mail-in ballots before the close of the polls on election day. I believe, Mike, one of those states is Florida. Is that correct? And so is Florida a state that, if there is a relative, bearing in mind that Florida, as you said, is always notoriously very close, if there is nevertheless a clear winner, will we know in Florida possibly on election night?
Yes, I think it's quite possible. So just to get into the weeds for a minute, because I'm sure this is very confusing and odd to a UK audience, but unlike most European countries, or probably all, we have different election counting regimens locally by state. Some states, the polls are open later than other states. In Florida, because the state spans 2 time zones, in the Panhandle, a heavily Republican area to the west, they're open an hour later because they're on the central time zone. So many states have an antiquated law that absentee ballots that come in cannot be counted. The counting process cannot begin till election day. That is the story in Michigan, critical state, story in Wisconsin, story in Pennsylvania, and I believe in North Carolina too, and many other states. So the problem is, in a year like this, where states that traditionally have low absentee ballot, like a Pennsylvania, compared to a California or a Florida, states that have a high traditional absentee ballot, the count will take a while. The Michigan Secretary of State originally predicted 5 days to count all the Michigan votes, and that could be half the vote, maybe even more. So that adds a lot of uncertainty to election night, as Claire says, and makes it tricky for the media to know what to do. Now, the other weeds point in all this is that Florida and Ohio, another state where people think Biden is quite competitive, which would be another huge win for the Democrats if they can pull it off. Ohio is a little different than Florida, but they also count preemptively. So Ohio and Florida, and later as we go west in time zones, Arizona, another swing state, are all going to have a lot of their absentee pre-counted. Now, there's always some vote that trickles in absentee. Most states, if it's postmarked by election day, there's a Pennsylvania controversy about maybe a 3-day extension. Those votes are counted. There are military ballots that are mailed from around the world. Americans abroad, there are people in the UK who can vote in an American election. So, there's always a few percent that staggers. But in Ohio and Florida, bearing some other problem, like the machines don't work or, an alien invasion. I mean, in American elections now, who knows? There are facts that could slow it down, but we're going to know a lot about 2 backbreaking states for Trump if he loses that Biden is competitive in, Ohio and Florida, by late on election day, and that could set a little the tone of the coverage. Finally, we have these exit polls in the U.S. I know the political culture in the UK is very poll-centric, and so they don't only on exit polls where pollsters interview people at early polling locations, they've been doing it, selected ones, statistically selected, and on election day, they've also been telephone and online polling for 2 weeks as massive absentee voters. So the networks have a not 100% reliable, but better than anybody else has, model of who voted on election day based on large-scale polling. And it'll be interesting to me to see, and I've been arguing for it, that they be a little more transparent on the absentee vote in the states that have a lag, simply to remove some of the mystery of it, so it doesn't become a fertile place for Donald Trump and foreign internet agitators to create disinformation and tear away at our political institutions, which, of course, in the last few years have been suffering.
Bob, I want to thank you. Bob, I want to put to you a question. We've had several questions about silent Trump voters. I think this is a phrase which actually had its origins in British politics with the 1992 general election, with the phenomenon of silent Tory, of shy Tories. Are there really shy Trump voters? If so, might this be the legion who troop out on election day and prove the pollsters wrong?
We went and looked for them. We have a panel of about 6,000 respondents, and they talk to our polling people about a lot of subjects, not just politics. And so there's a level of trust. So we think there are some, but not many, shy or silent Trump voters. But we also think there are some shy or silent Biden voters, especially non-college white women who are not going to tell a pollster on a telephone call with their husband sitting there that they might vote for Biden. So look, we are at a point where, and I'm stealing a phrase from Mike, Democrats are now the neurotic party. After having gone through 2016, completely certain that something is going to go wrong. And of course, there's a chance that Trump can win. But the fact is that people grab onto these scenarios. They're hidden Trump voters. 12% of African American men, or 20%, I saw in one estimate, are going to vote for Trump. Those are outliers. They could happen. I don't think they're going to happen. And the one thing I want to emphasize that Mike was talking about, and is absolutely right. Everybody sitting at every network is going to know if Donald Trump loses Florida, that he has virtually no path to an electoral college victory. That's why Florida, and when its returns come in, is so important. And if it happened in Ohio too, it would be not virtually no path, it would be no path.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, I think, and that's the advantage of that fantastic model that FiveThirtyEight have got, where you can take their model and then just change the result in one state. And I think if you give Florida to Biden, Trump's chances shoot down from 11 in 100, to use Claire's formulation, down to about 1 in 100, or less than 1 in 100, which makes the point that you are just making there very, very clear, I think. We've got people asking about particular states. We've talked a little bit about Florida. Let's talk a little bit more about Pennsylvania, which Clare emphasized FiveThirtyEight has identified as the most likely tipping point state. Who would like to talk about the likely? At the moment, Biden is running ahead in Pennsylvania by about 4 or 5 percentage points, isn't he? Depending on which polling average you look at. But then Pennsylvania was one of those states 4 years ago where there was a relatively big polling miss, obviously in Trump's favor. Claire, do you want to talk about the situation in Pennsylvania?
Sure. I mean, Pennsylvania is an interesting state because people will often say it represents a lot of different regions of the United States. So you've got Philadelphia, which represents kind of the East Coast Democratic, a multiracial liberal kind of coalition. You've got the center of Pennsylvania, which people will sometimes joke is essentially the South. And then you've got some of the industrial Midwest in the Pittsburgh area. So frankly, that's a pretty important area if you're just looking at these people that we called the Obama Trump voters, right? Those people the white people without a college education who were really key in deciding the 2016 election. So I think that's one of the reasons why Pennsylvania has become such an emblematic and important state. And obviously Biden is, claims very conveniently for electoral purposes, Scranton, where he was born and lived for a couple of years of his childhood, as his hometown. Philadelphia is where his headquarters are. So Pennsylvania is an interesting kind of it encompasses quite a bit about the dynamics of the election. And I think Biden has a decent chance, but of course it's that state where a lot of stuff could happen.
You mentioned earlier the court challenges. And as you, I think, said, Claire, this is particularly relevant in Pennsylvania. Can you just give us a little bit more detail on that? What's the situation right now?
So right now, ballots can be counted for 3 days after Election Day. Mail-in ballots can be counted 3 days after Election Day. But there was
you mean the ballots that are received over 3 days, right?
Correct. Yes.
They can be
It
counted
can be 3 days late,
to.
theoretically, when it shows up in the mail, or in. Anyway, go ahead.
Yeah. and this is all, you know, there's cascading court cases here to talk about.
Mhm.
But in a decision about a similar situation in Wisconsin, Brett Kavanaugh kind of gave an indication that, you know, maybe there was some differing opinions about vote count on the court. And then I believe we saw Gorsuch, you know, say 2 days ago that while we can't decide before Election Day whether or not these votes will be able to be counted, we could decide this after Election Day. That's a bit confusing, but basically it means this is still up in the air as far as the Supreme Court is concerned. So that's what I mean when there's a bit more fluidity in Pennsylvania, because some of it is, we're still hashing out all these mail-in ballot rules.
Thank you. Robert Hand, one of our audience, is asking particularly about Texas. Now, Texas is a state that has long been a Republican state, but which people have been talking about as a potential Democratic state for a long time now, given demographic change. Turnout, I believe, is enormously high in Texas. Mike, do you want to talk about Texas? What's the likelihood of it would be a major upset if Biden won Texas, wouldn't it? What are the chances?
Well, you know, Texas is kind of fun because it's the great Democratic holy grail to win Texas. And I tell my Democratic friends who ask me about Texas, do you really want to be that greedy? You know, here, beat Trump. You know, you may take Florida from the Repubs, and you're in the hunt in Georgia, which would be another huge win. You're in the hunt in Ohio, and all you want to talk about is Texas. You know, you're like complaining about winning the lottery and the gold coins are too heavy to carry home. So it is possible. There's been, again, this is going to be a very high turnout election. And traditionally, in American presidential elections, high turnout has been helpful to the Democrats because lower turnout voters who often skip local elections, who skip the midterm elections, tend to skew more Democratic. Now, the Trump campaign will argue they put a lot of effort into finding voters who demographically look like Trump supporters, which generally means no college education, white, working class, and they've signed a bunch of them up. Now, I'm suspicious of that because my experience in 35 years of running campaigns is in a high turnout year, it's hard to attract new people. It's just organically, people decide to vote or they don't. And if you're somebody of the Trump demographic, I'm not quite sure how you missed 2016. You know, it was pretty obvious. It was a very loud parade, and the idea you skipped it and waited 4 years to join the bandwagon is suspicious to me. I'm sure they've done it, but I'm not sure they've done it in a material way. It's quite hard to do technically too. But the argument for Texas is that Joe Biden is significantly ahead, potentially even, you know, 10 points nationally. And the demography of Texas, like Georgia, again, another state that's very much in play for Biden, has changed to kind of take the traditional Republican edge down. And because Donald Trump has managed to alienate the Republican suburbs, which has kind of been the bloody fingerprint on the Republican losses for the last few cycles in the midterms and special elections, you put all that together, and the big metroplexes, be it Atlanta or be it Harris County, Houston, or be it Dallas, Trump's in a squeeze. It's not unlike Pennsylvania. I was talking to my old friend Rick Santorum, former senator from Pennsylvania. He won there as a Republican. He's droid at Pennsylvania politics. And we were debating Trump at an event, but afterward we talked, and he thinks Trump may pull out Pennsylvania, but he says, you know, you look at it, if Trump's in trouble in Ohio and Michigan, he's in trouble in Western Pennsylvania too. And you know he's going to be in trouble in Metro Philadelphia and the Philadelphia suburbs, Bucks and Montgomery County in particular. So it's a hell of a squeeze play. Well, the same dynamic in Texas. If you lose the suburbs and you lose the metros, is there enough rural vote to make it up? And, you know, it's close. Now, most polls show Trump still with a tiny edge there, but the very fact Texas is in play and in a big wave election, it is possible, you know, tells you the tough situation the president is in right now.
Thank you. We've got a lot of people asking about the Senate, so I do want to just spend a few minutes on that. If there is a Biden victory in the presidential election, but the Democrats were not to take control of the Senate, that would severely circumscribe what a Biden administration could do. So what happens in the Senate matters enormously to the next few years of American politics. One question here, including for Bob and Mike's colleague, Peter Mankel from USC, my former colleague from Oxford, and Tom Packer Tom Packer's particular question, actually, I'll put to you. Why are Republican Senate candidates, why do Republican Senate candidates not seem to be running ahead of Trump to any significant extent? Who wants to take that? Bob?
Here, I'll do it. Look, they're married to Trump, and they're in a dilemma, and they've been in a dilemma for the last few years. If they created distance from Trump, even moderate distance, he would denounce them, he'd go after them, and you'd end up like Senator Flake in Arizona. You'd just not even run for re-election because you couldn't win a primary. At this point, I think a lot of them would like to create some additional distance, but the risk they run if they do that is that the loyalist Trump base will not vote for them, and they'll lose anyway. So they're in a very tight situation. If the election were held today, and it's going to be held in a few days, it is being held today, actually, but if we were finishing it up today, I think that the Democrats would take back the Senate. I don't know whether it be 50 seats, 51 seats, 52 seats, but I think that's very possible. Look, the last time we had a challenger win by anything like the order of magnitude that the polls are currently showing nationally was Ronald Reagan in 1980 when he won by 9.7 points. And Democrats lost 12 seats in the Senate. And I actually made an argument to Senator Robert Byrd, who was then the Democratic leader in the Senate, that Democrats could lose the Senate, assuming that this momentum for Reagan continued. And he just dismissed it. But election night, 12 Democrats went down. So if Biden wins by 9, for example, I think Democrats may take more Senate seats than we expect. If it's closer, the Republicans may hold on to the Senate.
Richard Carwadine asks where you would expect to see any surprises in the Senate results. Does anybody want to nominate a state where you may see a very surprising result?
Biggest surprise could be Alaska, which has very unique politics, and there's a Democratic challenger who's kind of a charismatic oddball. I want to disagree with Bob, my old friend, a little bit. There's one, look, I think it is more likely that the Republicans lose the Senate than win it. It's uphill. You know, the Democrats will have to win Republican-leaning states where the incumbents should have an advantage, but Trump's unpopularity is a big problem. And there are some states that are more Democratic, like Colorado and Maine. And if we have a big 1980 wave, it is possible. But the one difference between now and then is that our voters have become more siloed. In other words, the Democrats, there are about 3,300 counties in the U.S. And when Hillary Clinton got 2.9 million more votes than Donald Trump last time, she got the bulk of that vote from only 200 counties. So, you know, the Democrats do very well in the metros. The Republicans are spread out all over the country. So that has given the Republicans a little bit of an advantage. That's why Trump won the Electoral College. It was the distribution of the vote. So there's a little more of a headwind to a wave than last time. That said, if it's 9 points on Election Day, I'm with Bob. I think there'll be a Democratic Senate. Watch Montana, too, I think, as a possible Republican state that could buck the incumbent senator for a Democrat.
Claire, do you want to come in on Senate races in general? Are there any particular races you want to identify as ones you're watching closely?
I mean, I'll be the boring person and say, you know, there's, you know, some of these seats that are very close. Like, I guess I would say for a good narrative and a close race, maybe your British audience can tune into North Carolina, where a close Senate race had I would almost call it a refreshingly old school political sex scandal from the Democratic candidate, which, you know, I think, you know, Democratic Senate consultants aren't laughing. They're very annoyed at their, you know, military veteran, studiously centrist, you know, makes everyone feel comfortable white guy candidate who's making them a little bit nervous. So that's certainly, you know, one to watch. I think Iowa itself is interesting just for the fact that it's two women running against each other, and Joni Ernst is one of those. I think she's a very interesting Republican who has tied herself to Trump, but also, frankly, had an interesting personal story about, you know, being, you know, suffering abuse and being a little bit more behind the scenes. I think apologetic for supporting Trump in some of his his pursuits. And I think she's being punished a bit by the electorate because Teresa Greenfield, the Democrat, who's a total newcomer, is nipping at her heels. So those those are the kind of the races I'm watching are the boring toss-up ones, because I think it's really interesting to imagine what it would look like if the Democrats held government for a guaranteed 2 years, White House, Senate, and House of Representatives. I don't think Joe Biden is personally constitutionally inclined to increase the number of justices on the Supreme Court, but I think there'll be a lot of interesting things to watch, whether or not certain cities and territories are made into full states, if there are some of these more left progressive changes that are kind of pushed into Joe Biden's lap. I mean, Biden has, throughout the course of his career, you can kind of watch him hold the center of his party. He's gotten more liberal over time, but he's always hewed pretty close to the Democratic center. And if the Democrats are, totally in control, I think there's some interesting pressure that he's going to get from the left.
Yeah, thank you. No, it matters. It matters so much, doesn't it? The control of the Senate for the reasons you say. You were just sort of alluding there, Claire, to the possibility, implicitly, the probability of a Biden victory. Bob earlier said, I think borrowing Mike's phrase, called the Democrats the neurotic party. I think the phrase that Mike uses in his podcast is the bedwetting party, actually. There's certainly a huge amount of anxiety, isn't there, among liberals at the moment, who just kind of, after 2016, have some kind of PTSD and don't believe the polls. Have you, all three of you are in this business and you know this so well, have pollsters sufficiently changed their methodologies that you have greater confidence now in the polls? Never mind the fact that the gap is bigger anyway. So even if the polling error was as big as in 2016, Biden still has a cushion in most places, though not in Florida and possibly not in Pennsylvania, or very close in Pennsylvania. But setting that aside, are the polls themselves more reliable because of methodological changes or because of other things? Who wants to take that one? Mike?
I'll take a quick crack at it. So it's a mixed bag. Not all polls are created equal. And the problem with a lot of media polls is publishers are cheap. And cheap polling and cheap brain surgery are never a particularly good idea. That said, the best polls are doing a good job of struggling with the challenge of polling, which is the traditional telephone poll is very hard in the modern world to complete where you have a representative sample. It's easy to get a retiree watching television on a phone poll. Not so easy to get a working mom with 3 kids. So most pollsters now use a hybrid approach of some online polling, some telephone polling, and some even text message connected polling. And you can get a pretty good sample now. Again, it's always backward looking, but you can learn a lot. There are even some new tricks that we've been trying in Florida, because in these Florida polls, we will get a couple percentage who say they are undecided and a couple percentage who refuse to answer. So of course, we're obsessed with how these undecided, will they vote? Some undecideds ultimately don't vote. And second, who will they vote for? Excuse me. So, a cold. So the little trick we've been doing, we've kind of taken the Marquess of Queensberry rules of polling, and in a war against Donald Trump, we put them on the shelf for later. And so we will take from the sample, the 89 people say, who tell us either refused or undecided. We will look at how they answer other questions, but we will go into their voter file. And we will take all the commercial marketing information about, subscribes to Guns and Ammo magazine, that's Trump. And we score them based on all that voter information either way to be able to project who these shy voters on both sides. And Bob's right, they come in both flavors, they are. So that sort of modeling where you take traditional polling sampling, modern polling sampling, and a little bit of, we know so much about the voter file now, and you combine it, so it's not pure analytics, but it's not pure polling, we found to be a pretty good tool. So I would say net, the good polling is better.
And they've done one thing that I think is very important, Claire could talk about. A lot of the state polls in 2016 did not have sufficient filters in terms of college education, non-college education. And so they oversampled college-educated white voters, and that showed Hillary Clinton doing better than she was actually doing in those states. That has been corrected. That doesn't mean that there isn't another hidden error somewhere in there. But I will say that if somehow or other Trump comes on and wins this election, the 11% that Claire's talking about comes true, that will be pretty close to a catastrophe for the polling industry.
Yeah, I would say that's right, what Bob said. I think the biggest change, if you're going to actually look at what pollsters are doing differently from a methodological point of view, it is waiting for education based on what they learned. And in fact, if you want the the kind of insight into it, my two colleagues wrote what pollsters have changed since 2016 and what still worries them about 2020. They interviewed a bunch of pollsters and asked them literally, what are you doing differently? But I do think we have to remember, in 2016, different demographic groups behaved differently than we expected them to. Those white non-college educated voters in Ohio and Pennsylvania were considered Democratic voters, right? A lot of them are registered Democrats. And we also have to take into account that we didn't realize, how many of these more inactive voters were coming off the rolls and who hadn't been, taken into the universe of likely voters by pollsters. They were energized by Trump because Trump is a universally known figure in America, just as Hillary Clinton was, but him in a very different way. And he was getting lots of free media time, right? Like that was the big thing in 2016 was the earned media that Trump had by having all those rallies on TV. So I do think that we've hopefully gotten smarter about this. And I will say, there are fewer undecided voters this time around at this point. So I think people feel a bit more certain about, where the polls are at this point versus at this point in time in 2016, where tons and tons of news had just happened and a lot of voters were scattering a bit.
Quickly, I want to applaud Claire's point, because this is a huge deal about what happened last time. Networks pollsters, they tend to look at history, kind of a revert to mean theory, which has generally been true. We've never seen Trump's coalition before in 2016. He was doing worse than Mitt Romney in some counties in the suburbs, and he was doing better than Ronald Reagan ever did in some other counties. We'd never seen that coalition before. This year, we have seen what a Trump win looks like, where it happened, places where a pattern that's brand new. So we have something to compare it to instead of comparing it to Romney and McCain 2008. So the analysis on election night networks will be much smarter because they've actually seen the three-legged, albino leopard before. And so they can see clues now to compare today versus 4 years ago that they didn't have. And that'll help a ton in knowing what's going on.
Just want to move to a question really about stepping back a little bit from the weeds here and ask about what this election is telling us about the state of American politics. I'll put a question in that context from Chris Nitschke, who asks whether we can discern support for particular policies in the polling evidence we have, or in the qualitative evidence we have from the reporting of people like you, Clare, or is this an election that's really just a referendum on Trump and Trump's character?
Both. It's both. I mean, it's a referendum on Trump's character. There's no question about it. It's a referendum on Trump's performance, and the Biden people have worked hard to keep it there. But if you look at some of the issues Democrats are pushing, for example, pre-existing conditions, protection for people with pre-existing conditions in terms of their health coverage, taking action against COVID. If you look inside the polls, there's a lot of support for the Democratic positions there. That's why you have someone like Senator John Cornyn, the Republican in Texas, saying, I'm all for protecting pre-existing conditions, or David Perdue, the Republican senator in Georgia. So yes, there is evidence that on some of these issues, there's a lot of public support. But fundamentally, this race is a referendum on Trump. Although, if the one other caveat I would have is the Biden campaign, which was written off, and by the end of 2019, people thought basically he wasn't going to make it even through the primaries. The Biden campaign has been remarkably disciplined, and one thing they've done a very good job of, and Mike and I talked about this a couple months ago, because Mike said, Biden's not all that well known to the American people. they've done a pretty good job, starting at the Democratic convention and all through their advertising, of making him well known enough that he has a net favorable in most of the data, and Biden has, Trump has a net unfavorable, and it's a pretty big gap. So it's a referendum, but we know something about the issues, and people haven't fallen in love with Biden, but they've fallen in like with him.
Claire, do you have a comment on that? Trump versus the issues?
What I think is striking about 4 years of the Trump administration is actually there were very few policies that the American people were offered by the Republican Party. If you think about it, Trump's biggest moves were executive orders, or they were repeals. You know, the rallying cry in 2017 was repeal and replace Obamacare. There was and still isn't a Republican healthcare replacement plan. And I think we've sort of gotten used to empty rhetoric in politics, but I do think that the past 4 years kind of took it to the nth degree, where Trump's Republican Party turned into, there wasn't much of the kind of core ideology rotted out, and what was left was contrarianism, right? So if the Democrats are for this thing, the Republicans are against it. If the media says this thing, we're against it. And I think, you know, healthcare is popular. People don't want to lose healthcare. So certainly it was foolhardy of the Republicans, I think, electorally, and they saw the results in 2018 to try to go after healthcare. And I think, you know, Biden's campaign from the beginning has been pretty good about saying, like, we're going to stay in the steady middle, and we don't care if there's lots of shouting from our party's left. We're not going to do Medicare for all, right? I think that was the genius of their campaign, was like, slow and steady wins the race. We're signing off of Twitter, you know, which is what they were saying. But there hasn't been a lot of substantive policy discussion in American politics over the past 4 years. And I think that's something we should be honest about, because when we saw the pandemic hit, we saw that the American, you know, the administrative state had been hollowed out. The pandemic task force had been disbanded in 2018 or 2019. I mean, really basic social contract level, the basic job of the government is to protect the population. That stuff wasn't being taken care of. So it's interesting to talk about policy, because I think there's just been a dearth of it. So when the Democrats offer some policies up, people kind of say, sure, that sounds good. You know, and so it's a discordant and, you know, slightly dystopian political atmosphere to be talking about it in.
Policy
that's true. The Republicans have tried to govern while staying in opposition, which is kind of a tricky thing to do. And the Democrats have been happy to be in opposition. I mean, the only Republican policy was tax cuts and build a wall, and the Democrats tried to obstruct all of that, because Trump is much more comfortable running a campaign of grievance and opposition than he is in government. Now, I'll just say to your question, the campaign has been almost totally a referendum on Donald Trump, which is typical for presidential incumbents when they run. And while Trump has tried to make it about Biden, the Biden guys have been very good at kind of slipping the noose on that. And the Trump campaign has been so massively incompetent because it fluctuates every day to the whims of Trump. They'd never been able to get much of a sustained offense going. So Biden is in some ways the longest tenured but least examined candidate who's likely to be elected president, because the election is fundamentally about firing Trump.
Mm. So policy is one thing. Another is institutional change. The critique of people who oppose Trump is that, especially during the last 4 years, there has been a hollowing out of critical American democratic institutions in various respects. Another way of putting that is that the ascendancy of Trump and his kind of politics has illuminated some structural problems with the American system. I want to ask you all what you see as being the realistic, real world prospects for any meaningful institutional change, whether it is, Claire's already alluded to this, whether it is changes to the Supreme Court, an expansion of the court, or perhaps a changes in the nature of its jurisdiction, or whether it is some other change to do with the federal bureaucracy or even the Electoral College. Is there any, do you see any serious prospects of any meaningful institutional change, even in a scenario where Biden wins and the Democrats take control of the Senate?
Well, you're not going to abolish the Electoral College. That would require a 2/3 vote in Congress and 3/4 of the states. There is something called the Electoral College Compact, where states say we'll vote our electoral votes for the winner of the popular vote once we get to two states representing 270 electoral votes, a majority all agreeing to do the same thing. We're still pretty far away from that. Expanding the court, I think Biden, and Mike's probably going to disagree with me on this, I think Biden's done a very smart thing here, which is to punt this basically to 6 months into the administration, have a commission look at what the options are. I think what that's really about is seeing whether the court is going to act now like an ideological cult or whether it's going to act like a court. And when Claire was talking earlier about some of these Supreme Court decisions, it's very clear that John Roberts, the conservative Chief Justice, cares about the integrity and legitimacy of the court. And he will struggle, I think, during those 6 months to see to it that the court does not go too far. It's a conservative court, but that it doesn't turn into a kind of anti-New Deal version of the court that blocked almost everything FDR was trying to do for a while. The other institutional change that could happen is you could abolish the filibuster. And you can do that by a simple majority vote, which means that you don't need 60 votes out of 100 in the Senate to pass legislation. But you may not even have to do that because we have something called budget reconciliation. And you only need 51 votes in the Senate, or 50 votes if the vice president is from your party. You only need 50 votes in the Senate to pass things under budget reconciliation. And as long as they have a fiscal impact, they can fit in to that arcane category. In fact, some of the big, a big part of the Trump tax cuts were done through budget reconciliation.
Claire.
Yeah, I think, just to give listeners a little bit of a reality check, I don't think the court will be packed or expanded or however it is. I think the federal judiciary will probably get additional judges. In fact, that's been recommended by the kind of nonpartisan body that oversees the workings of the federal judiciary. So there probably will be more judgeship seats in the lower levels, so circuit court level or district court level, which is I think a baby step for Democrats. Institutional change is, I also think of it as just going beyond, the actual mechanisms of politics and lawmaking. I'm a member of the media. I'm a member of the press, which I think is an American institution. And I think that is another thing that I don't see a very clear answer for after the election, as far as changing the tenor of conversation and I don't quite know how to put it, accountability to reality and fact in the U.S. government, because, Democratic politicians are also known to play media boogeyman. So certainly not as badly as Trump, but that's certainly a thing that I'm keeping my eye on. But I do think that Biden will be a cautious president in many ways, despite what his party might want him to do, because I do think he is an institutionalist at heart. Let's not forget how many decades he spent in the Senate and how young he was when he was there. He is not a person who is, gonna go in and burn it all down.
Still thinking about the scenario of a Biden victory. Question for you, Mike. What's the future of Trumpism post-Trump?
Well, that's hotly debated now, and like all Washington conventional wisdom, it's said with great, conviction, but nobody knows. Trump has an appetite for public attention and approval. He also has legal problems with the Southern District of New York. So when he gets out of office, the conventional wisdom is Trump will still rule the Republican Party with an iron fist, and he'll try to run again, or one of his sons will, and the party will march in lockstep. I actually am very contrarian on that view. Losing does not give you a good political career. There was a time when Sarah Palin had a huge grip on the Republican Party, and today you can hire her to open a shopping center for $500. So I think if Trump has led us to the greatest defeat over the last 4 years in our political history, Trumpism will be a factor, and Trump's personality cult will be a factor, but by no means the overwhelming one. It'll be like the Chinese Civil War with 30 warlords with small armies running around. Some will be senators, Some will be governors. There will be different ideological factions. The kind of pro-business sanity wing of the party will be back. The Christian conservatives will be tired of sinners. There's no shortage of ego and ambition because Kamala Harris, the vice president, is going to be a real powerhouse within the Democratic Party, particularly in the demography of how they choose a nominee. But the Republicans are going to look at her and say, in 4 years, we can beat her for president. So the value of the post-Trump Republican nomination will rise, and there will be Trump imitators and Trump hybrids, but I'm not sure there'll be room for the proven loser of the Trump family brand, who again may be busy defending himself. So I don't buy all the CW that nothing changes at all. I think we're going to have an invigorating and exciting and very important civil war in the party to sort out what we are coming out of the rubble of the Trump presidency.
I look forward to hearing you talk about that in future podcasts, Mike. We're running out of time here, but a couple of final quick questions for Bob and Claire. Bob, you've been a senior advisor in presidential campaigns. What do you think both campaigns should be doing in these closing days if you were advising them now?
I don't think Trump should be doing these giant rallies. I think they're actually hurting him with people. They're hurting him with suburban women. They're hurting him with voters in the middle. I think Biden, I was very interested this morning on the news. Everybody was saying, oh, he must be worried he's going to the upper Midwest. Well, 3 days ago, they were saying, why isn't he going to the upper Midwest? I mean, that was Hillary Clinton's problem. She never went. So I think the Biden people, who have been very disciplined, have very good polling data, know what they're doing, and are probably on the right track. I think Trump is running on instinct and id. He believes that more than he believes any advice he gets. And I think he will end the campaign just as he has conducted it all along.
Claire, last question for you. I wonder if we're all here because we are fascinated by politics and we believe this matters a huge amount. Last question for you is about the many people out there who don't care about politics and who just want all this to be over and who are tired of it. And maybe they're tired of the Trump show, but they're tired of elections as well. I wonder how you as a reporter can convey their feelings and get a sense of how they're going to act in politics, but also how you think those people are how they're going to vote in this election, if they're going to vote at all.
Yeah, I mean, we're going to see high turnout in this election. I think it's going to be historically high. Politics has permeated American pop culture in every single way. But you look at these surveys about American attitudes, people are more cynical about government. People do not think government can get things done. People's attitudinal, positions towards America are increasingly negative. So people are burned out. And I would say probably a lot of Americans want politics to return to normal, but also we have fashioned sort of a cage for ourselves, which is politics can't go back to normal until people, for lack of a better phrase, engage with each other as human beings. I mean, I think that that's sort of the cheesy kumbaya way to say it, but I think we have a huge crisis actually facing American democracy, and it's civic and it's media related. It's related to the consolidation of media. It's related to the fact that states and areas that are poor do not see their realities day to day reflected in national news coverage. I'm from Northeast Ohio originally, and certainly in certain parts of it, it turned into Trump country, in part because people would say, well, Obama kept on talking about this great economic recovery, but Lordstown auto plant laid everyone off, and where are all the Youngstown jobs? So I think that people see a pretty dispiriting reality. I would guess that Biden will probably win this election based on the models, but also, just based on a kind of gut feeling of talking to people where he seems normal enough, and that's what people want right now. But I am pretty cynical about the way forward for American democracy. I think there are a lot of serious problems that we have, and they're not going away with Biden, nor probably with the next election. And I think that's a huge problem, And
on that note, and we're going to draw this to a close, we will be holding more events in the future in which we'll be picking up all of those themes that Claire mentioned at the end there. We've had a lot of questions. I'm so sorry that we haven't managed to get to so many of them. We've had a number of questions for you, Mike, about Gina Raimondo that we couldn't get to.
That's an inside joke on Hex on Tap. I'm always praising her. And I'll make one trivia point on the way out in the way of thanking you, Adam. Your panelists all have one thing in common, I believe. We're all graduates. Well, we all attended Georgetown University. I think so.
We?
So, yeah, we got a little reunion
I was
here.
there. I was there a little before you, Claire.
we're just some good Jesuit education here at Oxford.
That's right. Bob was there with the original founding Jesuits.
With Bishop Carroll, yeah.
Right.
Hoya Saxa.
Yeah, Hoya Saxa. And thank you, Adam.
Thank you all so much. Thank you, all three of you, for your time, especially now. I know how busy you all are. And thank you to everyone else. We've had a lot of people listening into this. Thank you so much for joining us, and do join us again at our future events. Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.